Thank you all for joining us today. As you may know, Silent Spring is a leading research institute dedicated to studying the links between the environment and breast cancer. This year, we're celebrating 30 years of advancing prevention science. If this is your first Science Cafe, welcome. Our Science Cafes feature conversations with experts on a variety of topics related to breast cancer and environmental health are made possible thanks to generous contributions to Silent Spring Institute. So thank you to our donors for supporting our science and these events. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we have two upcoming Science Cafes. The next one is on February 5th, and it's going to be focusing on Massachusetts PFAS and your health study, featuring our water quality expert, Dr. Laurel Shader, and staff scientist, Emily Heckel. And then on April 2nd, we'll be talking about creating healthy homes with our exposure scientist, Dr. Robin Dodson, and guest Amanda Reddy, Executive Director of the National Center for Healthy Housing and a research partner of ours. So mark your calendars, February 5th and April 2nd, and watch your inboxes for more information. A few details about today's event. Our moderator, Dr. Beth Whelan, will guide the conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the program for everybody for questions. The program will be recorded and will be made public. We invite you to keep your cameras on if you're comfortable doing so. We also request that you please keep yourselves muted just to avoid any interruptions by mistake. Throughout the program, please send any questions for our speakers to Alex Goho, our Director of Communications, who will hold them until the Q&A at the end. If you have any other questions, you can use the chat feature to message the meeting hosts directly, and the chat feature overall is now closed. So, except for to the hosts. So let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce you to our host and board member, Dr. Beth Whelan. Before joining Silent Spring's Board of Directors, Beth worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where she was a senior research epidemiologist at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. We are very fortunate to have Beth on our board and to have her moderate today's Science Cafe. And with that, I will hand things over to Beth.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. Today, we're going to hear Silent Spring Institute's new executive director, Dr. Mary Beth Terry, talk about breast cancer in young women, otherwise known as early onset breast cancer, why incidents are on the rise, and how Silent Spring Institute is uniquely positioned to advance research on this critical public health issue through its focus on prevention. Dr. Mary Beth Terry is an internationally renowned cancer epidemiologist with more than 25 years of experience leading studies on breast cancer risk factors, specifically the effects of environmental exposures on cancer risk. She joined Silent Spring this summer from the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, where she is Professor of Epidemiology and Environmental Health Sciences and Associate Director of Population Science at the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center. Mary Beth, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here with us to share your expertise and insights. And I'd like to start with the concerning news that we've seen recently about cancer rates going up in young adults. What can you tell us about these trends?
Sure, and thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to everyone joining this afternoon to talk about this issue. It is true that we're seeing a large increase in cancer rates in adults under 50. This is what we call early onset cancer. What's most striking, however, is not just the number of cancers that have been increasing, but a large proportion of these early onset cancers, in fact, 2/3 of the early onset cancers are occurring in women, not just in the US, but globally. So I promise this will be the only picture that we show today. But what you can see here on the left these are females under 50. And really, the number one cancer is breast cancer, followed by thyroid cancer. And what you can see is that early onset cancers are going up across the board. The majority of them are still in women, and that's predominantly breast cancer. So it is important, thank you for sharing that. It is important to keep in mind, though, that most cancers are still diagnosed under 70 years of age. But what is really new is really thinking about the rate of increase, so the percentage change. And it's very concerning because this is a period of life, as you know, that many individuals, they're developing and very active in their community with families, friends. It's an important time in their work life and also with educational responsibilities. And it's also important to recognize that many physicians, and when they trained, like I know when I trained, really the dominant paradigm back then was that if you had a diagnosis of an early onset cancer, it was because of family history. But these trends that we just showed you absolutely cannot be accounted for by changes in genes, because genes don't change that fast. So what we know about this rapid increase over time is that it must be from environmental changes. For example, like chemicals that we come in contact with in our daily lives, water that we drink, air that we breathe, food that we eat, because genes themselves do not change this rapidly.
Great. So maybe you could say a little more about why specifically we think it's the environment that's likely driving the rise in early onset breast cancer.
Certainly. So there's a number of lines of evidence that we have. First, our group has demonstrated that these early onset trends cannot be fully accounted for, but by what we would call the established breast cancer risk factors. So for example, we looked at data from over 30 years of 185 countries, and countries that have very high fertility rates, like countries like Yemen, for example, have still increased their early onset cancer rates over this period. So some people may assume that correlation is because of changes in fertility, but that absolutely cannot explain what we're seeing, again, because many of these countries that have high fertility still are seeing high early onset breast cancer. Also, it's important to recognize that with some of the other early onset cancers that are occurring, like colorectal cancer and some of the other gastrointestinal cancers, they may be attributed to changes in body size. And no, we always talk in public health about the obesity epidemic that's changed. But breast cancer, and specifically early onset breast cancer, can't really be attributed to changes in obesity. In fact, early onset breast cancer hasn't been associated for a large part with childhood obesity. So it's these factors that have been sort of hypothesized to cause early onset breast cancer can't explain it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people have thought that it is explained by those changes in reproductive factors, but you're saying it's not solely due to that.
Right, that's absolutely right. Yeah, and there's other lines of evidence that we know about. And for example, we know from some of the work that we've done is that there's a number of occupations where women now are participating in these occupations. And so, for example, with female firefighters, we've seen they have been shown to have higher rates of breast cancer. We've also seen that women who are active duty military women have higher rates of early onset breast cancer. So these types of occupational exposures are really important to think about, as well as being another line of evidence.
I know that there was a recent paper, Mary Beth, that Silent Spring published with the 900 chemicals that maybe you can say a word about that.
Sure, yes. This was a really important paper that came out just this past year by Silent Spring scientists. And what they found is that there's over 900 chemicals that are in everyday products that we use, again, foods that we eat, plastics that we use. In fact, about 400 of those 900 chemicals are in everyday plastics that we use with food packaging in particular, and other ways that we come in contact with plastics. And what they did, which was really interesting, is they looked at all the laboratory data that exists and looked at the function of exposure to many of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, as well as chemicals that can cause direct DNA damage. So cancer can occur from a variety of mechanisms, but the ones that these chemicals are known to do, they look specifically at endocrine disruption, which is changing our hormone levels, as well as directly damaging our DNA. So both of those are major pathways for increasing breast cancer.
Very interesting. So are breast cancer rates going up faster in younger women than older women? And why would that be? And what would be different about their environment? Do younger women have different exposures than older women, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, keep in mind that younger women, have, when they were born and as they grew up through adolescence, we've had a very different chemical environment. So another line of evidence that we have worked on over time has looked at what kind of chemicals you might be exposed to during gestation. So, some of the chemicals now that have been banned will lower that risk for the next generation, but there's many chemicals that still exist in our environment. So even after they've been banned, they still are in our soil or our water. And so as a result, we can still be exposed to those. Also, we just talked about plastics. So, I know certainly when I was growing up versus when my daughters have been growing up, there's just a very different environment when it comes to the products that are used, and specifically plastics in general. We didn't have single-use plastics as much, so that's just one example that's very different. We also know a lot more thanks to a number of Silent Spring scientists, including Alicia Franklin, that a lot of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in everyday products, personal care products that women of color use. Also now there's a lot more data about exposures to those products that may not have been used as much in the past. And so there's a lot more exposures that younger generations have that we didn't have at that age.
And did I read that the fastest rise is going up in women under 40 years of age? Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so again, this is of concern because, in general, most breast cancer is diagnosed later in life, but the rate of increase of these changes is quite high, and it's highest in women under 40. And this is really important signal because most women do not get screened for breast cancer until later. In fact, in most countries, it's not until you're over 50. Sometimes here in the US, and as many people on the call know, the guidelines have changed between 40 and 45. But when we look under 40, we know that those increases can't be explained by population-based screening using mammography. So we know that that has to be a real increase and not just an increase due to more screening, because screening will, by its nature, detect more cancers.
Interesting. So obviously we need more research on this topic. Can you say, why this is such a pivotal point, maybe for Silent Spring Institute specifically?
Sure. I mean, we're really at this critical juncture because exposure science has improved so much over the past couple decades. So we are now able to, with just a single biospecimen, whether that's urine or blood, capture exposures to hundreds of chemicals at a time, which is really important because that's how we're exposed to them. In the past, we typically could only really, in each study of humans, could only really look at one chemical at a time because of the expense in measuring these chemicals. Or we would ask people about their exposures on a questionnaire, which is really quite difficult. I know I, was exposed to a lot as a child, when we helped with, growing a lot of products in our backyard. We had a little bit of a farm that we tried, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what kind of pesticides we used or any of that. So it's important to have measures that are accurate, and now we have the ability to measure them. And we actually do have the cohorts that can, these kinds of measurements can be made at them. So we're really at this kind of critical juncture. We also, over the last 20 years, know a lot more about how our genes interact with these chemicals. So we're really at a point where we can produce rigorous research on these questions.
Great. So as you know, there was an article in the Boston Globe in October about breast cancer and reducing your risk. Like a lot of news coverage, the medical experts that were interviewed, they downplayed the role of the environment. What was your reaction to that?
Well, my first reaction was to write a letter to the editor to kind of get it right. But, you know, in all seriousness, it is really important to make sure that we all are exposed to kind of the latest science. And, you know, science is constantly evolving. So the science that might have been accurate when people were training is not the science that exists today. Further, I don't know if most people are aware, but environmental health science is typically not taught in medical school. I know when I taught medical students at Columbia, we introduced this, but it's not part of a curriculum. So it's important to have what's referred to as continuing medical units or CME kind of credit events, you know, to present the latest science. And Silent Spring actually led on this 3 years ago now with a large forum for these kind of continuing education units, which healthcare providers need to get every year. And then for the first forum was sponsored by Silent Spring in partnership with Dana-Farber, and last year was sponsored by Silent Spring in partnership with Columbia and Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center specifically. And we did receive a lot of really good feedback because this is really information that many physicians and nurses do want, but is, you know, something that is hard to know unless, you know, you get exposed to sort of the latest science in this area.
Right. And so that seems like a really important point. You know, we've got so little time with our providers, you know, when we see our doctor, and you can understand why there isn't time to have a lot of this discussion. But I think what you're saying is it's important for those, you know, healthcare providers, maybe even pediatricians specifically, for example, to start asking questions about people's environmental exposures, their hobbies, their jobs, right? That might involve these exposures.
100%. And again, physicians and nurses and all healthcare providers, they play such a pivotal role in promoting health, and they're really trusted members of our community. And so it is really important to start messaging on prevention much earlier in life. But yes, the challenges with the time that you spend with any one provider is a challenge to overcome. But I do think as trusted members of the community, it's really important that they're aware of the latest information on environmental chemicals.
Yeah. And I know one thing that Silent Spring has done recently, I think, is put things in the waiting room, little flyers and information packets in the waiting room. So if there isn't time to discuss with your doctor, at least there's something there that they can read that gives them a little more information about the possibility of potential exposures they might have.
Yeah, I think that's a great outlet. And I know in some of the clinics at Brigham and Women's, this has been done. And so I think that's really important.
Great. So during your career, Mary Beth, you served on boards and committees at the International Agency for Research on Cancer and the National Cancer Institute. What role can these groups play in moving the needle on environmental risk factors?
Yeah, another great question, Beth. Thank you. I think these groups are essential resources to provide this information about cancer causes. Often, you know, the first place people may go to find out information is through some of these organizations and trusted institutions. So I also know, though, in terms of rating chemicals, the International Agency for Research on Cancer is really the forum to go to, because they convene these very rigorous review panels of all the experts. They weigh all the body of the evidence, including laboratory and human data. And so it's really important to produce these kind of studies so that they're ranking on different carcinogens, which goes from being a known carcinogen to being a probable carcinogen to being a possible carcinogen. So it's important to have the data, and it's really important to have data in humans, because without that, the highest ranking, so to speak, that any kind of chemical exposure, environmental exposure could have would be a probable carcinogen. So in order to know that something is a human carcinogen, you need these studies in humans, which is why it's really important at this point, when we're able to do it, is to do more research on these early onset cancers.
Right. So how can Silent Spring contribute to that evidence that we need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this year we're launching a new comprehensive prevention program to address early onset cancer. So we're hoping to measure these chemical exposures in cohorts that we have already established. And we're going to be looking at when the breast tissue is most vulnerable to insults from these chemical exposures. And we're going to study how they interact with genes. And so we're really focused on doing this, and we can do this, and we have, the science is ready for these kinds of studies. And Silent Spring in particular has led on dissemination of results and report back. And so we're poised to get this information immediately back to the communities that need them, as well as the policymakers and the women themselves. So we're planning a comprehensive risk assessment program to do that. And then we're hoping with this data that we can then change the National Cancer Prevention Guidelines to include the environment. So to go beyond these individual risk factors such as physical activity or body size, and move to upstream factors that can be changed with local and state policies.
Right. So would you say that genetics does still play an important role in breast cancer?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you talk to a molecular biologist, they will say that all cancer is genetic. But what they mean by that is that, to have cancer, it requires alterations of your DNA. And that can happen from having a germline mutation that's inherited from your mother or father. It can happen, though, and does happen more often from changes in your genes throughout life. So that's what we call somatic mutations. And so it's still estimated that the bulk of cancers, anywhere from 5 to maybe 15%, are from germline mutations, and the bulk of the rest are from these somatic mutations. And what we also know from modeling is that half of those somatic mutations occur earlier in life, like before you're 25. So that's, again, why prevention earlier on. You mentioned pediatricians even, those are really important windows to speak. And, it also means that we still can, at any point in our life, reduce our risk of cancer by changing, our exposures and reducing our exposures to environmental insults.
Right. So speaking of that, what can women do today to reduce their risk? And what do you do in your own life?
That's a great question. So I do think it's really important to think about, again, at any point, you can always do more to reduce your risk. And so, it's really important to think about where you can is to, at an individual level, if you can change the products that you're using, or the household products, the cleaning products, or the personal care products. We do offer a free app that's called Detox Me that anyone can use, and that can provide some information about that. I do really believe, though, that it's important to get more active in, local and state and federal initiatives in this space, because, again, most of these exposures need to be altered through policy initiatives. It is important, though, to know that as a consumer, you can do a lot. So, companies do respond to consumer choice. And for example, some of the Silent Spring scientists recently produced some really interesting evidence on Prop 65, which is had been enacted in the 80s. And what they found, I don't know, I think there's some callers from California, so they can tell us more from their own experience. But I know when I've been to California, there's a lot more labeling that happens there, for example, like when you're buying a couch or something. And so what they have found is that over time, that led companies to just change what they put into a lot of these products. So consumer behavior can change, the marketplace a lot. And that's another way that some of our exposures can be reduced.
Right. Thank you. So up to this point, we've been talking about preventing women from getting breast cancer in the first place. What about women who've been diagnosed? How do environmental chemicals affect them?
Yeah, that is such a fantastic question, and it's a huge research gap. It's something we really want to address, and we're poised to do that with some of the cohorts we've been following. It's again trying to have the resources to do that. But what's important to think about why this hypothesis is an important one to look at is that, after your first cancer, you may have a higher risk of a second cancer. So it's certainly always important to think about reducing exposures. But also, many of the treatments that people are on for cancer therapies are quite effective, but they're on them for a number of years. And we don't know what the interactions are between these treatments and different exposures. And so that is a really important research area. We know, for example, from recent evidence with COVID, that people who lived in polluted neighborhoods had worse outcomes from COVID. We also know that people who have lung cancer are being treated for lung cancer, that they have also had worse outcomes if they live in a heavily polluted area. So, this interaction between the environment and treatment is a really important area that just has not been investigated, but is very important, particularly when we think about some of the latest cancer therapies, which are really, very effective, but do involve, either endocrine therapies. So if you're exposed to a lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals, you could hypothesize that you would have an interaction with your treatment, and or immunotherapies, which, if you're exposed to a lot of air pollution, that has been shown to affect some of your immune responses. So it's a huge unknown. I'm glad you asked the question, but it does require research. And again, research relies on the very generous volunteers that have helped us over the years investigate these questions.
Great. So, there was a lot of activism in the 80s and 90s that inspired investment in research on breast cancer, especially treatments. Would you say that young women today are as engaged?
I would. I mean, I am totally always impressed by younger generations. And I certainly think in the area of environmental health, the information flow, if you will, always has been from the younger generation to the older generations. I mean, I tried to start my parents' recycling, and I know my children have pushed me more to do a lot more, like with black plastics, and my kids actually don't eat out because of all the plastics exposure, which when I'm tired at the end of the day, I wish I could be as strong as they are in that respect. But I do think that beyond just within, families' share of knowledge, that the younger generations, particularly the younger public health students, the younger medical students, they all are being trained and in the social determinants of health, of which, many factors that relate to our environmental exposures, including occupations, including household, indoor air pollution, other upstream factors really are now, for the first time, being included as part of the medical record, which is a really great thing.
That's great. So this has been great. I want to take a moment now to open it up to other guests and invite other folks to ask questions. So if you have a question for Mary Beth, please put it in the chat if you haven't already, and it will go to Alex, who will read those out loud for us. And we'll do our best to answer all the questions. If we run out of time, we'll follow up later, and there'll be more information about how to follow up with us later too. So Alex, do we have any questions right now?
Yeah, we do. Thanks, Beth, and thanks, Mary Beth. The first question we have is, what about changing screening guidelines to include younger women, younger than 40, or screening them more frequently?
That's a great question. So I think certainly guideline changes should be considered as soon as new evidence comes up. I know the colorectal cancer screening guidelines just changed from 50 to 45. It's important to recognize, though, that changing guidelines to capture a whole population based on their age may lead to a lot of false positives. So I would see it would be really important to think first about changing the guidelines to recommend kind of higher risk individuals based on their occupation and or perhaps community exposures before saying, you know, everybody at a certain age, because again, there's a lot of false positives in younger women who are premenopausal. And so it's important to kind of balance those two things. But certainly what should happen is that if any woman feels, you know, a lump or has any kind of symptoms or her breasts feel different, she should go to her physician and should not, you know, be discouraged if the physician says you're too young to have cancer. Because what we're seeing from the data is nobody is too young to have these cancers. And so it's just really important for people to keep pushing for the care that they need.
Okay, our next question is, why are African-American women more susceptible to early onset breast cancer under the age of 40?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So, so what we've seen over time has been a change in these trends such that the rate of increase for women of color has increased. The mortality rates remain higher. And so again, a lot of the hypotheses around that is regarding exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so again, some of my colleagues at Silent Spring are doing some really interesting work in this space. And I do think there have been now important studies that have linked some of the chemicals that are in some of the personal care products to breast cancer risk.
Next question. If a woman is under 40 and has the BRCA gene and gets breast cancer, would you still view this as possibly triggered by environmental conditions?
That's a great question. So again, for an individual themselves, unfortunately, and this is the frustrating thing, we can never say for any one individual what caused their cancer. At a population level, we can say, okay, if we remove asbestos, you see a decline in lung cancers. If we change the smoking regulations, you see a decline at a population level. So for an individual, we can never say, you know, it's because of X, Y, and Z. What we also should say, though, is BRCA1 is the breast cancer susceptibility gene that has what's referred to as the highest penetrance or probability of getting breast cancer. However, there's no single gene, including BRCA1, where you have 100% probability of getting a cancer. And that's where cancers are very different than other genetic diseases, such as Huntington's disease, where then the question is more like when you will get it. So I guess in answer to your question, all cancers are an interaction between your genes and your environment.
Next question is, what does early onset breast cancer risk look like internationally? Are there specific countries that are most vulnerable?
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, it really has been sort of a sea change in just 30 years. So countries like India that have huge population density, the highest cancer as recent as 2 decades ago was cervical cancer. Now the highest cancer in females in India is breast cancer. So it really is seen kind of on every continent, but but Antarctica. We were talking about that at the beginning of the call with Georgia. But yeah, so it really is across the globe. And so what's interesting to me about that as an epidemiologist is that there's very different diets around the world. It's being seen, early onset cancer is being seen in countries that don't drink, for example, even though we know alcohol is one of the risk factors for breast cancer, but early onset breast cancer is increasing even in countries where individuals don't drink. So it definitely is something that is being seen in a variety of different environments. And so you can't just point to diet or alcohol or something.
Okay, our next question is exposure to PFAS chemicals contributing to increased breast cancer in young women?
That's a great question. I would say there's, as of today, there's not enough studies on PFAS and breast cancer. There was a recent large one published this past year, but there needs to be a few more studies in my mind in order to see if there's a consistent pattern. We do know, though, from laboratory research as well as some epidemiological research in humans that PFAS chemicals can affect breastfeeding and perhaps some other reproductive health conditions. So I do think it needs to be researched more. And we know also that PFAS does increase other cancers like thyroid cancer. You saw on the graph earlier, thyroid cancer is the #2 cancer in women. And again, 2/3 of all early onset cancer are in women.
Next question is, what about critical windows of exposure in utero, puberty, pregnancies, and menopause?
Yeah, another great question. So what we do know over time is that the breast is most susceptible to carcinogens when it's changing, right? So your breast changes the most when it's developing in utero, as well as there's like right after birth, there's this period of what's called infant puberty where, boys and girls develop breast tissue and then it regresses. That period hasn't been studied as well, but we've been studying more and more what happens during puberty itself in young girls. And also pregnancy, lactation can change the breast tissue. And then finally, for the older people in the audience, we know that how much the breast can change over the menopausal period, which is a much longer period than any of these other periods that people are talking about. So it doesn't mean that you're not susceptible to cancer outside of those windows. It just means you're more susceptible during those windows.
Next question is, how might RFK Jr. being head of HHS affect funding for breast cancer research, including cohorts that include young women?
I have no idea about that question. I do think that it's very important to advocate, and I wasn't aware of this until recently, but because when I was a student, I was always taught that the first studies of cancer were in the 50s with smoking and lung cancer, but the first study of cancer was a female physician in the UK 100 years ago from in the 1920s, and she found pretty much what we knew about breast cancer for the next 70 years, which is if you had an earlier pregnancy and you had many children, and if you breastfed, you'd be less likely to have breast cancer. And so it's just really interesting that nothing else was studied until the 90s. And then why were more things studied in the 90s? Because of breast cancer advocates, which pushed their Congress people to have a law to study for example, what went on in Long Island. That was a study I participated on. The Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition pushed the state to have a Cape Cod study, which is what was developed into Silent Spring, because they had this vision to have like what they referred to as a laboratory of their own, like a laboratory to push for science about females. So I know there's a huge deficit of what we know about women's health, but I know women can be very influential in getting that funding, whether they push their congressman, they push their state legislative body, or, you know, now Melinda French Gates is doing a lot with women's health. So I do think there will be other avenues, and I have no idea what's going to happen at the NIH level, but I do know it'll be important to have advocacy, because that helps in getting funding. And just a quick shout out to the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, which has been doing a lot of work and wants to do more work in the environmental space because of environmental justice issues. And so they have an open period of public comment that anyone on this call could write in. It's due by December 31st, but you can write in and you can say, I would like more funding to go to X, Y, and Z. So it is important to think about, you know, grassroots organizations and pushing of, you know, health agenda. And yeah, in terms of, you know, what will happen top down, I don't know, but there's definitely always room, and there has been a lot of influence bottom up.
Next question is, how can we reduce exposure to plastics in medical environments? Being treated is so exposing to both patients and hospital teams.
So that's another, yeah, that's another wonderful question. I know the state of California has a law that was just passed, where within 10 years, the hospitals there will have to switch to, you know, reduce the use of certain chemicals that are used in plastics. So I know, again, some of that has to come through policies and thinking about it that way.
Is there any research that shows whether or how chemical exposure is related to breast density, which we are told is a risk factor for breast cancer?
Yeah, I caught the second part. So
I can reread it again.
Yeah.
Is there any research that shows whether or how chemical exposure is related to breast density, which we are told is a risk factor for breast cancer?
Oh, okay, that's great. I feel like that question got planted because I just gave a talk on that in Australia, but I guess it wasn't a plant, huh? But anyway, so I do think there's actually growing research. So the sister study, that's a national study of breast cancer, they published just this past year a number of interesting studies looking at mammographic density with metals, and showing, you know, some associations with metals, you know, including arsenic, magnesium, mercury, nickel. And they also looked at PFAS and published some work with mammographic density and PFAS. And then, or it may have been a different group, but there's been some really interesting work on mammographic density in young women and PFAS. So those studies have just come out this past year. We had over the years looked at, in collaboration with these older birth cohorts, the relationship between prenatal exposures to organochlorine pesticides and mammographic density, and found associations too with just that prenatal exposure of some of these chemicals. And those were measured by using the mother's blood, and then linking it to the daughter's breast density later in life. So yeah, so there's definitely some studies that have looked at that. And then most recently, our group has been focused on using this kind of novel measure to to examine breast density that doesn't rely on any kind of radiation. And we'd like to do more studies in that area because that's something that could be looked at more with young girls and looking at with certain interventions. And so that's basically works by shining a light source. And you're able to look at like different constituents of the breast tissue. And so using that, we did see some association again with prenatal exposures and some of this adolescent breast tissue, because one big thing that's happened in the US in particular, but also globally, has been, even though the age at first menses has been pretty much around 12 for a number of decades, the age at the first breast budding has gone down quite a bit. And so there's, again, that window of susceptibility that's wider. So, you know, I don't want to say that menstruation or pregnancy or any of these what are called risk factors, they are not cancer causing. They don't cause cancer. They're not carcinogens. Pregnancy is not a carcinogen. We should not blame people for not having babies early enough. But what happens is when you have your menstruation or when you have your pregnancy, that can kind of lengthen that window. So, you know, which would be no problem if we weren't living in a chemical environment, but because we are, then it creates that risk.
Really exciting, Mary Beth, that there's a potential way for us to look at breast tissue without looking at having mammogram data.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
Mary Beth, somebody had a question about the wisdom study. Are you familiar with that?
I am, yeah. And in fact, I might participate. I always like to join studies because I do think that if, you know, you can't promote research without being part of it. It's on my list of things to do maybe over the holiday break. But yeah, so the study itself is looking at whether or not we could have more personalized regimens, if you will, for screening. So meaning, you know, instead of using age-based guidelines is to, you know, look at someone's underlying genetics, and it pretty much focuses mostly on germline genetics, and then making a recommendation that you should have an earlier mammogram or a later mammogram.
So the question then related to that is, how might Silent Spring bring its interest in the environment to a study like that?
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that these markers of environmental exposures, you know, are finally getting I don't want to say cheaper, but more reasonable in terms of measuring them. I think it's possible to see in the future, just like you would measure someone's lipid levels, you could measure their genes, you can measure their environmental exposures, and you could get this integrated kind of picture of someone's health that could inform sort of their screening regimen.
Next question is, what is your recent experience with physicians and their interest in acknowledging environmental exposures as a serious risk? The few physicians I've spoken with have dismissed the idea with a wave of the hand and say there is little or no evidence. And this is sort of related to a question was asked earlier, but maybe you could expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, and that relates to the letter to the editor for the Boston Globe. Yeah. So what I have found, again, I collaborate with a lot of oncologists and you know, they do wonderful research. What I found in general is that the way physicians are trained is really to think about the randomized clinical trial, meaning like clinical trials themselves, where you can put someone on a treatment and someone else randomly doesn't get the treatment, is viewed as the gold standard. But we know that no cancer cause, including smoking, ever had that kind of study design. So I think it's important to recognize that we can measure these environmental exposures well, and just as well, you know, that are replicable now that we couldn't before. So we are at this really critical juncture, whereas before it was much harder to measure these outside of an occupational setting. So I do think that it's important when there is pushback like that for people to recognize that smoking, radon, viruses, everything that we know are causes of cancer were never like found through a trial. They were found through some of the same studies that we're doing with environmental chemicals.
So just to follow up on that, Mary Beth, do you think, should we be trying to make more inroads in medical school education to have more of an emphasis on environmental risk factors and maybe just more public health prevention in general,
Definitely, I think so. I mean, I think it's definitely prevention itself has to be hit from many different angles because I don't remember who said it, but the expression is 80% of health happens outside of the hospital. So, it's important to again, because physicians are very trusted members, it's important to have education of whatever the latest science is. For that audience, but it's also important to think of other ways of getting that information out.
And I guess short of that, what we want to do is have as much education ourselves as patients to advocate for ourselves and to ask the questions of our providers if they're not asking them of us.
I think that's great. Yeah. And again, nobody should ever tell you you're too young to have cancer.
Our next question is, scientific inquiry for environmental exposures is the first step to provide preventative healthcare for communities. The next step is working with government, industry, and medical facilities to address and regulate exposure concerns. Who are some of the stakeholders Silent Spring Institute is working with to address this?
It's a great question. So from the beginning, Silent Spring Institute has always worked with community partners. In fact, it was started by a group of breast cancer advocates. So, the patient advocacy community are really critical stakeholders, community groups in general. Again, state and local governments, national governments, international organizations. So, and Silent Spring has worked on each of those different levels of influence, and we participate in giving our scientific feedback on different legislation and things like that.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, while we are working to reduce chemicals, clothing companies that manufacture exercise apparel like Lululemon are adding stink-proof properties to their products. Do you know anything about these stink-proof properties and their potential toxicity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we don't recommend any particular brands or products as an institute. But our general advice is really to look for untreated natural fibers and to avoid clothing with any special performance claims such as wrinkle-free, odor-resistant, antibacterial, stain-resistant, or water-resistant. So by looking for these sort of untreated natural fibers, it really can help limit your exposure to things like formaldehyde, PFAS, other endocrine disrupting chemicals. And just in general, we advise, washing your clothes before wearing.
We're going to shift again gears back to sort of more molecular biology, but are there any studies to show a reduction of exposure can reduce cell change or mutations? So actually, I guess markers of disease or whatever.
Yeah, what a fabulous question. I know one of the projects that some of our scientists are working on right now involves that. And it will be, looked at more with different intervention projects we have planned. But yeah, it's definitely something that that science is looking at now, and specifically our scientists are.
This is interesting. Are there kinds of screenings like mammogram, MRI, sonogram more effective for different age groups?
It's a great question. So generally, the effectiveness of screening is related to your density of your breast tissue. So when the breast is very dense, meaning there's less fatty tissue, mammograms are not as effective. So then it would be better to have either an MRI or a sonogram. So it's somewhat age related, because when women go through menopause, they sometimes transition so their breasts are less dense, but not always. So you can be an older woman and still have very dense breasts, in which case it would be better to use like a sonogram or an MRI.
And do you know, Beth, are those offered now more routinely?
They're certainly offered for younger women. And now with the legislation to inform people about breast density, they can be followed up on if, if the mammogram is not as effective. But the sensitivity of mammograms themselves are, it's lower the more your density is higher. Yeah.
This is sort of related. It's a question about sort of the relationship between like stress and breast cancer. So one question is, do you see any correlation between environmentally triggered cancers and say like a stressful or abusive home environment, for instance?
That's a great question. And I know people have tried to tackle it over the years with questionnaires, which are really hard to kind of get at that. There now is more validated questionnaires that does stressful life inventory. We just used that in a recent study of ours. The study's still ongoing, so I can't, I don't know what the data will show, but I also know that there's other markers of stress. So, people have done studies looking at, a panel of biomarkers that are related to stressful conditions. And in young women, actually, we did some preliminary work because even though estrogen and progesterone change with the menstrual cycle, androgens are fairly stable, and androgens can be a good marker of stress. Not necessarily the stress you're talking about, but regular kind of chronic stress. So I do think, just as methods to measure environmental exposures are becoming more rigorous and reproducible, I think the measures of stress, it's really the big kind of gap in a lot of cancer research, and a lot of people ask about it.
Can Mary Beth expand on her point just now about getting more active in state legislatures and affecting policy change? Is this work Silent Spring plans to do or partner with local groups on?
Yeah, no, that's great. So I'm constantly amazed at how different the states are with respect to even things like their cancer control plan. So a cancer control plan is something that is supposed to target resources for the next 5 years in terms of how each Department of Health at each state focuses on controlling cancer. And so I've been active with the New York State Cancer Control Plan, specifically with our environmental working group, which I've headed up with colleagues. But the best way to get really active is to participate either through organizations at your own state level. I know we're represented by a lot of different states today. You can get involved. A lot of patient advocacy organizations do have connections with their state rep, and some of the state laws do change the national environment, like we were talking about with California. So California was with Prop 65 has really led to a lowering of exposures in like the entire nation, because the companies switched the chemicals they were using. So that's really interesting work that just came out this year that was produced by Kristen Knox and colleagues here.
Okay. This is somewhat related, and I'm also just going to put we've got time for maybe like a couple more questions. So if you have another question, please feel free to put in the chat, but I'll just, we have one more question here. In order for environments to support human health, disciplines need to work collaboratively to understand the impact of lifestyle, as well as the spaces within which humans live, work, play, and heal within holistically. From your perspective, where do you see this type of collaboration happening?
That's a great question. Yeah, and I think that's in science, we always call it team science because, you need everybody at the table. You can't solve a complex set of diseases, so hundreds of cancers that we have with one discipline. So I think it's really important to start as early as possible with science education. I think, public health and academic medicine in general has moved away, sometimes not fast enough, but from this kind of deficit model where, the expert waits until the expert knows and then shares that information, to what we call this dialogue model, which involves stakeholders, policymakers, scientists. So that kind of process of collaboration needs to, be kind of the model for everything, because the waiting until we know is how you lose trust in any kind of community or any kind of society. Because why should, if I have the information, not share it with you? I can say it's not 100% certain, which, nothing is, but we can have a dialogue and we can have a conversation. So the more people share information across disciplines, across communities, I think the better off we all are. And that's really our principle in sharing information and returning individual results.
This reminds me of something. It's related, just how unusual Silent Springs research is, in that it is so interdisciplinary, and also related to that, using such unusual data sources sometimes, which really gets to this point of really thinking outside the box, collaborating with organizations that are not typically, historically, that epidemiologists would collaborate with. I wonder if you could say a little more about that. It's a pretty unique approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It does get you to think outside of the box. I don't think there's a single person here who has the same degree as someone else. So we have all different levels of background. And yeah, I definitely think that the lines of evidence have to come from a variety of different sources. At the end of the day, it can't all be about mice. And at the end of the day, it won't all be about humans because of the cost of some of these studies. So it's really important to know what you can take home from each of these studies and where your gaps are.
Okay, I think that's all we have for questions. Thank you so much, Mary Beth, and I'm going to pass it back over to Beth to wrap things up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mary Beth. That was such a fascinating discussion. I loved having all the questions. If you think of a question later that didn't get answered, so you can email Quinn Fey, F-E-Y, Assistant Director of Development, at fey@silentspring.org. And know that Silent Springs' work to prevent early onset breast cancer is only possible because of the support from generous individuals like yourselves. We're excited to share that this month an anonymous donor is matching donations up to $200,000 to support this particular research on early onset breast cancer at Silent Spring. So if you haven't yet, please consider donating before December 31st and reach out to the development team. Again, that's Fey, F-E-Y, @silentspring.org with any questions. And we will email you a link to the recording when it's available. And thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.